The morning of August 16, 1944, arrived with the kind of deceptive beauty that made Klaus Weber distrust the world. Sunlight filtered through the apple orchards of Normandy, casting dappled shadows across the muddy road where his men had bivouacked during the night. Birds sang in the hedgerows, oblivious to the thunder of distant artillery that had become as constant as breathing. Klaus stood apart from his sleeping company, smoking the last of his Russian cigarettes, a habit from the Eastern Front that he couldn't shake, and watching the western horizon where American guns flashed like summer lightning. Something was wrong. The feeling had settled into his bones during the night, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 years of hell in Russia. The artillery pattern had shifted. The roads behind them, which should have been their lifeline back to the Seine, had gone strangely quiet. No supply trucks, no reinforcements, no motorcycle couriers racing past with orders, just silence, and that was more terrifying than any bombardment. Klaus pulled out his diary, the leather cover stained with mud and blood from a dozen battlefields. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, not from fear but from exhaustion that had seeped into his very marrow. August 16. The birds still sing here, just as they did in the forests outside Stalingrad. I wonder if they sang while we froze and starved in that cursed city. I wonder if they will sing while we burn in this green hell of France. Behind him, the camp stirred to life. Feldwebel Richter moved among the men with quiet efficiency, rousing them for another day of what headquarters optimistically called tactical repositioning. Klaus had learned to translate military euphemisms during his years of service. Tactical repositioning meant retreat, strategic withdrawal meant rout, temporary setback meant disaster. The language of defeat had its own vocabulary, carefully constructed to avoid the weight of truths. Private Otto Schneider sat beneath an apple tree, writing another letter to his mother in Hamburg. The boy, and at 19, he was still a boy despite the uniform, wrote home every day, filling pages with careful lies about the beauty of France, the camaraderie of his comrades, the certainty of victory. Klaus had read enough of these letters, censoring them as regulations required, to know that Otto was trying to preserve something pure in his mother's mind, some version of her son that hadn't yet been corrupted by the reality of modern warfare. The letters never mentioned the bodies rotting in the summer heat, the screams of wounded horses, the way the smell of death clung to everything until you couldn't taste your food anymore. A motorcycle courier appeared on the eastern road, riding hard, his face gray with dust and something else. Klaus recognized that expression. He had seen it on the faces of men bringing news from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from every place where the Wehrmacht had learned that courage and discipline were no match for overwhelming force and industrial might. The courier saluted, handed over the dispatch pouch, and departed without the usual exchange of information that soldiers shared. That alone told Klaus everything he needed to know before he broke the seal on the orders. The paper felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the lives of the 140 men under his command. Hauptmann Weber is to withdraw his company immediately to the Diaries River crossing at Trun. All units of 7th Army are to proceed through the corridor between Falaise and Argenton with maximum speed. Enemy forces are attempting to close the pocket. Time is critical. Klaus read the orders 3 times, his mind automatically calculating distances, march rates, the condition of his men and their equipment. 15 kilometers to Trun. Perhaps 6 hours on foot with full kit, longer if the roads were clogged with other retreating units. The orders said nothing about what lay west of them or east or north. The silence around those facts was more eloquent than any intelligence report. Richter, Klaus called, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had given too many orders that sent men to their deaths. Assemble the company. We move in 30 minutes. The Feldwebel's expression didn't change, but Klaus saw the understanding flicker in his eyes. Richter had been with him since Poland, had survived France in 1940, had frozen with him outside Moscow. They shared the wordless communication of men who had witnessed the same horrors and somehow remained functional. As the company formed up, Klaus walked among them, noting the worn boots, the patched uniforms, the hollow eyes of men who had been fighting since the invasion began 2 months ago. They were veterans now, the ones who had survived the hedgerow fighting, the brutal attrition of Normandy's killing fields. They deserved better than to die in a trap of their own generals' making. Marie Dubois watched the German soldiers from her kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of ersatz coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She had lived through the last war in this same farmhouse, had watched different armies march past in different directions, had learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your opinions to yourself. But this felt different. The Germans had been in her barn for 3 days, polite enough in their desperation, taking her eggs and chickens with apologetic efficiency. Now they were leaving, and the speed of their preparation told her what her ears had already confirmed. The Americans were coming and the Germans were running. She thought of her husband, dead these 20 years, buried in the cemetery at Verdun with 100,000 others. She thought of her son somewhere in a labor camp in Germany, taken 2 years ago and never heard from again. She thought of the apple trees her grandfather had planted, now scarred with shrapnel and bullet holes. War had taken everything from her except this land, and now the land itself was about to become a battlefield again. Klaus finished his inspection and returned to the head of the column. He opened his diary one final time before they marched, needing to record this moment, this transition from hope to acceptance. We are ordered to retreat through a corridor that may already be closed. I remember Stalingrad, the slow death by cold and hunger. the gradual realization that we were abandoned. This feels different. This will be fast. If I die here, let it be known that we followed our orders to the end, that we maintained discipline when everything else had fallen apart. The Eastern Front taught me how to freeze. France will teach me how to burn. The road to Trun revealed itself like a vision of damnation as Klaus's company crested the hill above the Diaries Valley. What should have been a simple country lane had transformed into a writhing serpent of metal and flesh, stretching from horizon to horizon in both directions. Thousands of vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, horse-drawn wagons, even a few precious tanks, crawled forward in a procession so dense that individual machines became indistinguishable from the mass. Between and around them surged rivers of men on foot, some in formation, most simply walking, their faces blank with exhaustion and the peculiar resignation of soldiers who understood they were trapped. Klaus halted his company at the roadside, studying the chaos with the practiced eye of a veteran officer. The mathematics of disaster presented themselves with brutal clarity. One road, perhaps 20,000 men and vehicles trying to squeeze through a gap that narrowed with each passing hour, the Allied armies closing from north and south like the jaws of a vice, and above, the clear August sky that promised perfect flying weather. Mein Gott, Richter breathed beside him, and Klaus heard genuine fear in the Feldwebel's voice for the first time since Russia. They joined the column at a crawling pace, Klaus's men wedging themselves between a supply truck loaded with wounded and a horse-drawn artillery piece whose team looked ready to collapse. The smell hit immediately: unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, horse manure, and underneath it all, the sweet sick odor of gangrene from the wounded men who lay in truck beds and wagons, their bandages black with dried blood. No one spoke much. The column moved in an eerie near silence broken only by the grinding of gears, the clop of hooves, and the occasional barked order that went largely ignored. Otto walked beside Klaus, his letter-writing materials tucked safely in his pack. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in the scale of the retreat, and Klaus saw him trying to process what it meant. This wasn't tactical repositioning. This was an army dying on its feet, a great beast wounded and trying to drag itself to safety before the predators closed in. The first aircraft appeared at 1100 hours. Klaus saw them before he heard them, dark specks against the northern sky, growing larger with terrible speed. Someone shouted a warning that rippled through the column like electricity. Men looked up, and Klaus watched hope die in their faces as they recognized the distinctive shapes of RAF Typhoons, their wings heavy with rockets. Off the road, into the ditches, Klaus screamed, but his voice was lost in the sudden roar of panic as thousands of men reached the same conclusion simultaneously. The column disintegrated into chaos, soldiers abandoning vehicles and diving for whatever cover the Norman hedgerows provided. Klaus grabbed Otto's collar and dragged him toward a drainage ditch as the first Typhoon began its attack run. The sound came first, a shrieking howl that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Then the rockets, 8 of them streaking down from the Typhoon's wings like the fingers of an angry god. They struck a fuel truck 200 meters ahead, and the world became fire. The explosion lifted the truck off the ground, transforming it into a ball of orange flame that consumed everything within 50 meters. Men caught in the blast simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the heat. Others, farther from the epicenter, became running torches, their screams high and inhuman as they staggered blindly before collapsing. More Typhoons followed, and then American P-47 Thunderbolts, their radial engines producing a different note in the symphony of destruction. They came in waves, methodical and professional, working the length of the column with the efficiency of farmers harvesting wheat. Rockets and bombs struck vehicles at regular intervals, creating a chain of explosions that marched along the road. The fighter bombers' machine guns raked anything that moved, their tracers drawing geometric patterns of death through the smoke. Klaus pressed himself into the mud of the ditch, his hands over his ears, his mouth open to equalize the pressure from the explosions. Beside him, Otto was crying, not from fear but from the sheer overwhelming horror of it. A horse, its hindquarters blown away by a rocket strike, dragged itself past their position using only its front legs, screaming in a way Klaus had never heard an animal scream before. Someone shot it, a mercy that came too late. The attack lasted 15 minutes but felt like hours. When the aircraft finally departed, their ammunition exhausted, they left behind a landscape transformed. The road had become a graveyard of burning vehicles, their metal frames twisted into abstract sculptures by the heat. Bodies lay everywhere, some intact, many not. The wounded crawled or lay still, their cries for medics creating a chorus of agony that rose above the crackle of flames. The sweet smell of burning flesh mixed with diesel and cordite, creating a stench that Klaus knew would haunt him forever. He pulled himself from the ditch, his uniform soaked with mud and other men's blood. Around him, survivors emerged from cover, their faces blackened with smoke, their eyes showing the peculiar glaze of men who had witnessed something beyond the normal scope of human experience. The column, what remained of it, began to reorganize with the automatic discipline of German soldiers, but Klaus could see the change. Something fundamental had broken. The men moved like automatons, their humanity temporarily suspended by trauma. Otto sat in the ditch, writing frantically in his letter book, his hands shaking so badly that his script was barely legible. Klaus looked over his shoulder and read, "Mama, I cannot describe what I have seen today. The road is paved with bodies and burning metal as far as I can see. The aircraft come and come and come, and we have nothing to fight them with except our rifles, which are useless against machines that fly faster than sound itself. I am not afraid to die, but I am afraid of dying like this, burned alive like an insect under a magnifying glass." If you receive this letter, know that I thought of you and Papa and our house in Hamburg at the end. Klaus wanted to tell the boy to stop writing, that such letters only made things harder, but he understood the need to bear witness, to record the unrecordable. He had filled 3 pages of his own diary during the brief lull, his handwriting deteriorating into jagged scratches as he tried to capture the incapturable. From her cellar beneath the farmhouse, Marie Dubois felt the explosions through the earth itself, a rhythmic pounding that shook dust from the ancient beams above her head. She had retreated underground when the first aircraft appeared, her survival instincts honed by the previous war guiding her to safety. Now she waited in the darkness, listening to the battle rage above, wondering if her house would still be standing when silence finally returned. The afternoon brought more attacks. The Allied pilots had found their target, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Klaus's company, reduced now to perhaps 90 men, abandoned any pretense of staying with the main column. They moved through the fields parallel to the road, using hedgerows for cover, advancing in short rushes between aircraft runs. Behind them, the highway had become what the soldiers were already calling the corridor of fire, a 15-kilometer stretch of road where nothing survived for long. Klaus saw a wagon full of wounded take a direct hit from a rocket, the explosion so powerful that it left nothing but a crater and scattered pieces of men and horses. He saw a Panzer, one of the precious few remaining tanks, brew up when a bomb penetrated its thin top armor, the crew's screams audible even over the explosion as they burned inside their steel coffin. He saw men go mad, simply standing up and walking toward the aircraft as if surrendering to the inevitable, cut down by machine gun fire before they'd taken 10 steps. By evening, Klaus had lost count of the attacks. The aircraft came in relays, one wave departing as another arrived, maintaining constant pressure on the dying column. His diary entry for the day consisted of a single sentence: "Hell is not fire and brimstone. Hell is a clear summer sky and the sound of approaching engines." Dawn on August 17 arrived without mercy, the sun rising over a landscape that no longer resembled anything natural or sane. Klaus had not slept. Sleep had become an abstract concept, something from a previous life when the world operated according to comprehensible rules. He sat with his back against a shattered stone wall, his diary open on his knees, but his hand had stopped moving hours ago. The words had run out. Language itself seemed inadequate to the task of describing what the highway had become. The road stretched before him like a monument to industrial-scale killing, a museum of destruction curated by machines that flew faster than thought and struck with the precision of clockwork. Every 20 meters, another burning vehicle, every gap between vehicles filled with bodies in various states of destruction. The dead lay in positions that defied anatomy, twisted, compressed, scattered. Some had been killed so quickly that their faces still held expressions of surprise. Others had died slowly, crawling away from burning vehicles, leaving trails in the dirt that ended abruptly where strength had finally failed. Klaus forced himself to write 3 words: "Cannot stop looking." The Allied aircraft returned with the sunrise, and Klaus understood with terrible clarity that yesterday had been merely preparation. Today would be the culmination. The pilots had spent the previous day learning the terrain, identifying targets, developing their tactics. Now they arrived with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. The first wave came from the east, typhoons flying so low that Klaus could see the pilots' faces behind their canopies. They seemed impossibly young, these men who dealt death. Such casual efficiency. Their rockets streaked downward in perfect geometric patterns, each strike calculated to maximize destruction. A fuel convoy erupted in a chain reaction that consumed 30 vehicles in less than a minute, the explosions rolling down the line like dominoes made of fire. The heat was so intense that Klaus felt his skin tight from 200 meters away. Richter appeared beside him, his face no longer recognizable as belonging to the professional soldier Klaus had known. The Feldwebel's eyes had acquired the 1,000-year stare of men who had seen too much, his movements mechanical and disconnected. "Orders, Herr Hauptmann?" he asked, and Klaus heard the absurdity in the question. Orders, as if orders mattered anymore. As if anything mattered except the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next moment of not being torn apart by high explosives. "We move north through the fields," Klaus said, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Stay away from the road. Stay away from anything that might draw attention. We're infantry now, everything else is abandoned." The decision to leave the vehicles had been inevitable, but it carried consequences that Klaus felt in his chest like a physical weight. In the trucks they were abandoning lay wounded men who could not walk, 37 of them, their injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to burns to shattered limbs. The medics had done what they could with dwindling supplies, but these men needed hospitals, surgeons, morphine, care that no longer existed in this collapsing pocket of hell. Klaus went to each truck, looking into the faces of men he was condemning to death. Some understood and accepted it with the stoicism of soldiers who had always known this possibility existed. Others begged, their pleas mixing with the screams of the newly wounded, as another wave of aircraft struck the column. One young soldier, his legs crushed beneath a collapsed vehicle wall, grabbed Klaus's hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave us to burn, Herr Hauptmann," he whispered. "Please, anything but the fire." Klaus left his pistol and 3 others beside the truck. He did not explain, the men understood. When he walked away, he heard the first shot and forced himself not to look back. Mercy had its own sound and it followed him into the fields. Otto had stopped writing letters. The boy walked beside Klaus in silence, his letter book abandoned in a ditch somewhere behind them, its pages filled with words that would never reach Hamburg. His rifle hung loose in his hands, and Klaus saw that Otto had finally crossed the threshold that separated soldiers from survivors. The boy's face had aged a decade overnight, his eyes holding the peculiar emptiness of men who had witnessed the dissolution of meaning itself. They moved through a wheat field, the grain chest-high and golden, absurdly beautiful against the black smoke that rose from the highway. Behind them, 63 men, all that remained of Klaus's company, followed in a loose skirmish line. They had abandoned their packs, their extra ammunition, everything except weapons and water. They moved like ghosts through the wheat, and Klaus thought about how easily they could simply lie down here, let the grain hide them, wait for the Americans to arrive and end this nightmare with the relative mercy of captivity. But training and discipline and something deeper, perhaps simply the inability to stop moving once motion had become the only response to chaos, kept them going. They navigated by the smoke columns, using the burning highway as a reference point they dared not approach. The fields were not empty. Other soldiers had made the same calculation, abandoning the death trap of the road for the uncertain safety of open ground. They passed small groups of men, some organized, most simply wandering, their unit cohesion dissolved by trauma. At mid-morning, they crested a small rise and Klaus saw the full scope of the killing ground. The highway stretched for kilometers in both directions, a continuous line of fire and destruction. Aircraft circled overhead like carrion birds, diving at intervals to strike targets that caught their attention. The sound was constant: explosions, aircraft engines, the secondary detonations of ammunition cooking off in burning vehicles, and underneath it all the screaming. Always the screaming. Klaus opened his diary. His hand shook as he wrote, "The highway moves, living things crawl, metal burns. Sky brings death, cannot think, cannot stop." Otto silent, Richter gone inside himself. "I commanded men once, now I lead ghosts through wheat while the world ends behind us." The entries were fragmenting, his thoughts breaking apart under the sustained pressure of horror. He recognized this dissolution, had seen it in other men during the worst days at Stalingrad. The mind could only process so much before it began to shut down non-essential functions. Language became difficult, linear. Thought became impossible. What remained was pure survival instinct, the reptilian brain taking control while higher functions retreated into protective numbness. An American P spotted their movement in the wheat and made a strafing run, its 8 machine guns tearing through the grain like an invisible scythe. Klaus threw himself flat, pressing his face into the earth, feeling the impacts walk past him so close that dirt sprayed across his back. When he looked up, 3 men were dead, their bodies torn apart by the 50 caliber rounds. The others were already moving again, not running, just walking with the mechanical persistence of wind-up toys. No one stopped to check the bodies. The dead were beyond help and the living had nothing left to give them. They found Marie Dubois' farm in the early afternoon. The house still stood, though its roof had been holed by shrapnel and one wall had collapsed. Marie herself emerged from the cellar as they approached, her face gray with dust. Her eyes holding the same hollowness Klaus saw in his own men. She looked at them without fear or welcome, simply acknowledging their presence as another element of the catastrophe that had engulfed her world. Klaus tried to speak, to explain or apologize or simply acknowledge their intrusion, but words would not come. He gestured toward the well and Marie nodded, understanding the universal language of thirst. While his men drank, Klaus walked to the edge of her property where it bordered the highway. The road was perhaps 50 meters away, close enough that he could see individual details of the destruction. A horse lay dead in its traces, its cart overturned and burning. Beside it, a soldier sat with his back against a wheel, his hands pressed against a wound in his stomach, his face turned toward the sky as if searching for answers in the smoke. As Klaus watched, another wave of aircraft arrived and the soldier simply closed his eyes, accepting what came next. The rockets struck with surgical precision and the man disappeared in fire. Klaus vomited into Marie's wheat, his body rejecting not food but the accumulated horror of 36 hours without respite. When he finished, he found Marie standing beside him, offering a cloth. She said nothing, but her presence carried a strange comfort. She had survived one war, she would survive this one. The land would remain after the armies had destroyed each other and moved on. There was something eternal in that knowledge, something that existed outside the temporary madness of military violence. "How do you bear it?" Klaus asked in French, surprised that he could still form sentences. Marie looked toward the highway, then back at her damaged house. "I bear it because I must," she said simply. "As you do, as we all do, until we cannot." They rested at the farm for 2 hours, the men collapsing in whatever shade they could find, their bodies demanding payment for the sustained adrenaline of the past day and night. Klaus sat with his diary, trying to record what he had seen, but his entries had devolved into fragments. Burning, always burning, sky full of metal birds, Otto's eyes empty. Richter speaks to dead men, road paved with bodies, cannot count the dead, numbers meaningless, everything meaningless except next step, next breath, next moment of not dying. The afternoon brought fresh horrors. A convoy of ambulances, clearly marked with red crosses, took direct hits from rockets. Klaus watched from the wheat field as wounded men, some already bandaged, burned in vehicles that should have been sacrosanct under the laws of war. But laws required mutual agreement, and the pilots above saw only targets, only the opportunity to inflict maximum damage on an enemy that had brought total war to their doorstep. The red crosses meant nothing. Everything burned equally. Otto was hit during the late afternoon. They were moving through another field when aircraft appeared without warning, diving from the sun. The strafing run lasted seconds, but when it ended, Otto lay in the wheat with a hole in his chest the size of a fist. Klaus reached him first, knowing immediately that the wound was mortal. The boy's lung had been destroyed, and pink foam bubbled from his lips as he tried to breathe. Klaus held him, cradling Otto's head in his lap, and watched the light fade from eyes that had been writing letters to Hamburg just yesterday. Otto's lips moved, forming words that no longer had sound, and Klaus leaned close, trying to hear. "Tell Mama," Otto whispered, each word costing him everything. "Tell her I was brave." "You were," Klaus said, lying with the automatic kindness of officers who had watched too many boys die. "You were the bravest." Otto died with his eyes open, staring at the sky that had killed him, and Klaus closed them gently before standing. They left him in the wheat, no time for burial, no energy for ritual. The dead were everywhere now, so common that each individual death had lost its power to shock. Otto became another body in a field full of bodies, another name that would appear on a casualty list, another mother in Hamburg who would receive a telegram and spend the rest of her life wondering exactly how her son had died. Klaus's final diary entry for August 17 consisted of a single word, written in letters so large they filled an entire page. Enough, but it was not enough. The killing continued into evening. The aircraft working in the golden light of sunset, their shadows racing across fields turned into graveyards. Klaus and his remaining men, 41 now, less than a third of what he had commanded 2 days ago, moved like automatons through the smoke and fire, heading north toward a gap that might not exist, toward safety that was probably illusion, toward anything except the highway that had become a monument to the industrial efficiency of modern death. Behind them, the Falaise Pocket continued to close, and the highway continued to burn, and the aircraft continued their methodical work of destruction. Klaus no longer looked back. Looking back required the kind of emotional engagement he could no longer afford. He walked forward because forward was the only direction that mattered, each step taking him farther from the corridor of fire, even as he understood that he would never truly escape it, that the highway would follow him through whatever remained of his life, a road paved with bodies and burning metal that stretched from Normandy into every dream he would ever have again.